So thank you for joining this webinar today. We often call this Minding the Business While Changing the World. It's about the legal obligations that charitable board members have towards their organizations. Board members have very critical legal obligations to the organizations that they serve. And so it's critical that people know how to do that in the proper way. And so we want to provide a number of tools that help good people do good things the right way. And many times people are involved in organizations because they're passionate about the mission or the programs, but being a cheerleader for the group is not enough when you're a board member. And failure to know and understand what some of those obligations are can really jeopardize the future of your group. And first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you for taking time to contribute to your communities. Thank you for being involved in a charitable organization and trying to make the world a better place. We all benefit from the countless services of countless charities that provide all kinds of things that our families and loved ones rely on. And those things don't come magically. It requires a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from people who are involved in those charitable organizations. And so even though we are the regulators in the charitable law section, we too have family members relying on all those wonderful programs, and we are grateful for the contribution of time and energy that so many people put into helping guide charitable organizations. So we start out with a great respect and appreciation for the work that you're doing. So one of the responsibilities that we feel very committed to is trying to put tools into the hands of those who have taken on the challenge and the responsibility of stepping into charitable organizations as board members or key leaders. And so we want to help good people do good things the right way. We have a number of materials on our new website, which you can find at charitable.ohioago.gov. You'll find that all the information about charitable issues can be found in that one place. And so I invite you to check out the web page because you may find a number of other valuable resources that you might want to share with others who are involved in your organization. This is a shot from our new web page. It has a new look and feel. And then I also want to call your attention to two publications that are on our web page that I think every board member ought to look at least once a year. One is called A Guide for Charity Board Members, and the other is called Avoiding Theft. Both of these publications have critical information that everyone serving on a board ought to refresh themselves on at least once a year. So please check those out. You'll also find that we have other webinars available, other pre-recorded and live webinars. We have a number of publications. We have a nonprofit newsletter that you can subscribe to. It goes out electronically. So again, we're trying to put tools in the hands of people who are contributing to our communities. Many people are initially surprised to find out that the Attorney General is involved in the work of Ohio's charities, but it's actually one of the oldest responsibilities of the Attorney General, and it goes back to jolly old England during the Elizabethan times, and it was not uncommon back then for people to leave behind gifts to care for, like, the orphans of a village. And sometimes the trustees of those funds, they helped the orphans in the village. And sometimes those trustees helped themselves and instead used the money for faster horses and shinier coats of armor, whatever they spent money on back then. So in 1601, they developed the Statute of Charitable Uses that says the Attorney General shall have the authority to stand in the shoes of the beneficiaries and force the trustees to do the right thing. And so we maintain that common law authority as well as additional powers granted to us by the General Assembly. And every day our work focuses on whoever the beneficiary is intended to be behind charitable gifts and charitable organizations. So we're doing our work on behalf of children with cancer, veterans, senior citizens, those that are identified in the missions of so many of our wonderful organizations. And so what we want to make sure of is that the board is ensuring that the resources it's been entrusted with are spending them in a way that propels the mission instead of, sadly, investing in personal interests or faster horses, so to speak. When we look at the wide range of charities in the state of Ohio, it's a vast array of organizations. They could be multi-million-dollar organizations with thousands of employees, or it could be very small grassroots organizations. Think maybe like a group of grandmothers who might form a reading club in a local park to help kids develop a love of books. They're certainly going to have no employees, and they're going to have precious few resources. But regardless of how big or little, how complex or how grassroots the organization is, when you're serving on the board of any organization, you have the exact same identical duties and obligations. Now I'm going to quickly run through some very basics that every board member should know about their organization. And you, as a board member, every year ought to check and verify whether your governmental filings are up to date, because there are 3 government entities that will be routinely involved in the operation of every charity in Ohio. So let's assume that there's been a new high school built, it's Anywhere High School, and there's going to be a new athletic booster club that's adopted. So the first step, and whether you're an existing organization or a brand new one, it's useful information to know about. So the first step is going to be going to the Ohio Secretary of State's office, who has the responsibility of not only elections in the state of Ohio, but any entity doing business in the state of Ohio needs to register with the Secretary of State's office. And so what we commonly would choose to do is to incorporate a nonprofit corporation as the corporate form of the Anywhere Booster Group. And so they have a lot of wonderful materials on the Secretary of State's webpage to walk you through how to do that. But we're basically going to file articles of incorporation, and assuming we've done that properly and nobody else uses the name Anywhere High School Boosters, they are going to grant us, we will become a nonprofit corporation in the Secretary of State's office. Now, also, we need to identify a statutory agent for that nonprofit. Every nonprofit needs to have a statutory agent, as does every for-profit corporation. And that's recording where any official correspondence ought to be set. So when you identify a statutory agent, you're going to have an ongoing responsibility to make sure that that person hasn't moved away 8 years ago and is an invalid address or contact point. So always make sure you know who your statutory agent is, so that if someone bequeaths you millions of dollars in California, that lawyer is going to be able to find the appropriate statutory agent to send you a congratulations letter. So you will have an ongoing connection with the Secretary of State's office, because every 5 years you need to file a continued existence statement that tells the Secretary of State that you're still in business and they should still keep protecting your name. If they don't hear from you, they will cancel your articles of incorporation. So I suggest that at the beginning of every program year, every board member just go in, use the business search function, look up the name of your organization, and see what it says. It will tell you what year you need to file that filing. So if you check it every year, you'll never miss that 5-year filing. And additionally, take a look at who your statutory agent is. Make sure it's not someone that has moved to Florida, because you may need to update it. So every year, make sure you know what your trading card with the Ohio Secretary of State's office would say. Now, for this new booster club, the next step is to go to the Internal Revenue Service to get an EIN, and that's an employee identification number. It's a very simple process. That number will be a unique identifier for your organization that will follow you through the life of the group. So that's a very simple activity to do. The next one is a bit more difficult because you're going to want to file to be recognized as tax exempt. Now, there are many different types of tax exempt organizations. There are 501c4, C5, C7, 8, 9, 19. Your homeowners association is tax exempt. The Elks Club is tax exempt. The Chamber of Commerce, credit unions, they're all tax exempt. But what we'll be interested in doing for this booster group is setting ourselves up as a 501c3 organization. That's the only type of tax exempt entity that can accept tax deductible contributions. And you're going to have to be able to convince the IRS through your application that your organization is not set up for any sort of personal benefit for those that are involved, but it's going to serve a broad community purpose. So for instance, I could set up a nonprofit to give scholarships to my family members, but that would not be a qualifying IRS purpose for a 501c3 because that would be considered personal benefit, helping my family. But if I set up instead a charity to help graduates from my home county where there's an undefined community of beneficiaries where I don't even know who is going to benefit, that would meet a 501c3 purpose. So the 1023, which is the form that the IRS requires for requesting tax exempt status, and there are instructions on the IRS form for completing that, will ask for details about what you plan to do with this group and how it's going to operate. Assuming you have satisfied the IRS in explaining your charitable purpose, you will receive a letter that acknowledges that you indeed now have 501c3 tax exempt status. After receiving that recognition of your status, every year you're going to need to file what's called a 990. And this is an informational return that one is public record, and anytime you're asked for it, you need to provide it. Many groups put it on their webpage. It explains the activities from the past year, how you received money and how you spent money, those kinds of details. If you fail to file the 990 after 3 years, your tax exempt status will be revoked. So every year, one, you ought to be looking for the plan for how your 990 is going to be prepared, who's doing it. You should review it before it gets sent in. But another beginning of the year checkup issue for board members, go to irs.gov and use their search process to look up the name of your organization, and you can do it by name or EIN, which would be easier, and make sure it acknowledges that yes, indeed, your organization is in good standing and eligible to receive tax deductible contributions. If it says no, you're going to want to follow up with them ASAP to get that rectified. And then the third governmental entity that you're going to have ongoing business with is the Ohio Attorney General's Office. In most states in the country, there is a responsibility to do a state registration filing of some sort. Most commonly, it's done through the Attorney General's Office, like it is in Ohio. Some states, it might be in the Secretary of State's office. In the state of Florida, it's through the Department of Agriculture. So you need to know what the requirements might be in any other state if you're engaged in doing programming there or fundraising there. But in the state of Ohio, every Ohio charity and any charity soliciting Ohioans needs to register in our online system, and you need to make annual filings. And those filings are part of information that donors and the public can look up about your organization. And so every year, you should go into the registration system, look up your organization, and make sure that it says, yes, you're in compliance. And we're going to touch on that a bit later. We do have a separate webinar about all of the details of the charitable registration system. So every year, Make it a point to go in and look up your organization with all three entities so that you know what might be expected. Make sure that you're compliant. Now, I do want to mention that there's one large exception to what I just went through. If you are an exclusively religious organization, so if you're a church, temple, synagogue, mosque, you do not have to ask the IRS for permission to function as a 501c3, and you don't have to file a 990. Neither do you have to do a filing in the Ohio Attorney General's office. So there's a special exemption for exclusively religious organizations from those final filings that I just discussed. Now, unfortunately, these are the situations we encounter far too often. Someone has done something to harm your organization. Someone has taken resources that should have been used for some valuable mission or program and used them for themselves. Most often, it's not a stranger, it's someone who has been very involved with the activities of the organization. And so when this happens when you're on the board, it's a heartbreaking thing. I mentioned it's usually someone that's been very committed to the activities of the organization. So you feel this sense of personal betrayal. You feel a sense of embarrassment because you were at the helm when this happened. Many times the money is gone. It can't be recovered. And sometimes there might be some community embarrassment involved. And then, sadly, those who are supposed to benefit from the efforts of your organization are impacted. Sometimes groups can't survive this sort of thing. When you're on the board of an organization, your number one obligation is to have policies in place that make this very difficult to happen, or policies that will allow you to discover it very quickly should something go wrong. One of the things that folks often make a mistake about is using blind trust in how they run these charitable organizations. I was on the board at my church, and I became the treasurer. And at my church, once you became treasurer, you were the only way to get out of it was to die or move out of state. And I didn't really want a long-term job, a life sentence of being the treasurer, and we didn't have many policies. So we spent time deciding, what does it look like to do a responsible job running the financial operations of my church? And so we went through and identified what ought to be in a monthly report that would go to our council, what kind of financial information, expenditures, income, expenses. And before it went to the council, that report was going to be double checked by 2 of 5 people who also had access to go into our online bank account and verify that I had provided complete information, that there weren't unexplained transactions in our bank account that somehow weren't accounted for. And so they would help identify any errors I might want to have made, but most importantly, they were there to provide an assurance that the information I had provided was complete and accurate. Because folks that do harmed organizations often are the only ones ever involved in financial transactions. No one else ever looks at the bank accounts, ever reconciles or double checks. And so it may be quite some time before one of these organizations discovers that their treasurer has been making monthly withdrawals from the bank account and just making transfers to his or her own banking account. It's heartbreaking when that happens. It can go on for a very long time because, unfortunately, people don't know that internal trusts, that trusting people is not an internal control. There are people who you may not know it from the surface, may have gambling problems, drug problems, emotional problems, financial problems. These are things that go on behind the closed doors of Ohio families all across the state. So rather than guessing who that might impact, develop policies that ensure multiple people are involved in checking and double checking information regarding your financial transactions. It's just like if you are taking in cash at an event, you ought to have at least 2 unrelated people counting the money. It's far more difficult to convince 2 people to commit fraud than just one, especially when no one is listening. So regardless of how trustworthy you think someone might be, develop these processes. The one publication I noted called Avoiding Theft in Your Nonprofit, it has 20 plus ideas for various approaches that your organization might want to consider adopting. And those procedures will vary based on the activities of your organization, what kind of group you have, what you engage in. But you must make sure that you have internal controls and policies developed that protect those really scarce resources that you have to meet your mission. Doing it the right way takes only marginally more work, and it buys a whole lot of sleep at night. And let me also point out, these policies, well, number one, they're your job, your legal duty as a board member to do, but they protect the organization. Number two, it protects people doing these important roles. So when we changed things at my church, I didn't feel like I was in it all by myself. There were people also invested in the, continually improving how we were operating financially. And third, it also helps with continuity issues because I am no longer the board member, the treasurer at my church. Other people agreed to step into those important roles because they didn't feel like they were in it alone and they didn't have to feel like they were starting from scratch. So it is critical that every board, no matter how big or small, take a look at how you're running your financial operations and make sure there are policies there that protect what you have. Now, what do we as a state charity regulator do? Well, we get complaints that come in from the public every day that express concerns about the operations of a particular charity. Sometimes they come from community members, employees, sometimes board members, who say, we think something is going wrong here. Now, we also license bingo, and I'll mention that briefly later on, but sometimes the complaints might be, they were not very nice to me last Tuesday night at the bingo game. Well, that complaint is not going to get the same kind of attention that a complaint from a board member of an organization shares with us saying, I'm on the board, I've repeatedly asked for financial information and reports from our executive director and the treasurer, and they refuse to share any details with the board so that we can make responsible decisions. That's going to get a lot of attention from us. We have a staff full of compliance examiners, accountants, investigators, lawyers, and so we take a look. We take all complaints seriously, and we have the authority to do investigations. Sometimes we take a look at what's going on in the charity, and we may find that there's absolutely no indication that what's in the complaint is accurate. And so we're happy to close it and move on to something else. Sometimes, while we may discover that the complaint seems to be invalid, we might find an organization that doesn't have their board governance practices up to speed. And so we'll provide some technical support and try to get them operating to a place where they should be able to operate safely into the future. Sometimes we have to file suit. We may file suit and try to close the organization down because we think it's a sham charity, or we may file suit to remove certain people from the board or to recover misspent money. And then sometimes we work with local law enforcement on criminal sanctions connected with what we discover. So the results of our work can be, quite varied depending on what we find. If you have information about a charity that you think has problems, please file a complaint in our system, because again, what we want to do is turn off the leaking faucet as quickly as possible, because the needs are great and charitable resources are scarce, so we don't want them leaking out of the system. Now, I mentioned our online charitable registration system. We have a separate training on this, but we suggest that at least 3 people with every organization develop a personal account, which you can set up in our system. And when you have a personal account, you can connect yourself to 1 or more charities. And then whenever there's a filing due in our online system, everyone connected with that account will get an email reminder of an upcoming filing deadline. You'll also get a copy of any information that is shared about this organization, or data changing, the data, or a filing of an annual report. You'll get a copy of exactly what was filed. So it's a way to keep everybody up to date. It's also, when there's multiple people, if Mrs. Smith finally retires to Florida, and she's the one that did it every year, we hope that by having 3 people, that reminder email won't fall through the cracks. Now, I mentioned that I think every year, every board member ought to go into our system, and this is a screenshot of our Research Charities page. You can type in the name of an organization or the EIN, and if that charity is in our database, up will pop a screen of information. It's going to show some basic demographic information about how to reach the organization, and here's an important item. Is the organization's registration status current? Yes or no? Important that it says yes. If it says no and you have an account in our system, you can go to a to-do page. It will tell you what's missing. It's important to make sure it says yes, because 1, the public sometimes checks this to verify that the organization is in compliance with state law. Many times, governmental entities and granting organizations and United Ways will insist that there's an acknowledgement that the organization is up to date with the required filings in our system. So you always want to make sure it says yes. And then we'll also provide for the public some basic financial information that is provided in the filings. Now, we're going to run through some statutory provisions that affect the work of every charity. And let's take a look at some of those. So a big one that we have is the Ohio Charitable Trust Act. And charitable trusts are what are required to register in our charitable registration system. And some people say, I'm not a trust. I didn't come from some probate case where someone left a large trust behind. But those terms within 109 are defined very broadly. So it's defined as any entity that is holding money or assets that you've told others are going to be used for some sort of charitable, religious, or educational purpose. You have created a charitable trust, regardless of whether you're incorporated or not incorporated, whether you're tax exempt or not tax exempt. Some people think they can fly under the radar by not doing those filings, but if you walk like a duck and talk like a duck, then you need to act like a duck. And so if you are telling anyone that if they entrust assets to you that are going to help some important charitable cause, then by golly, you have certain obligations to live up to the promises that come with that sort of situation. And again, we do have, unfortunately, folks that are willing to take advantage of the generosity of others who may collect funds and not be connected with a particular charity. And they think that they can fly under the radar. But if you walk like a duck and quack like a duck, we're going to treat you like a duck. And if you're committing fraud, we will come visit you. The Charitable Trust Act creates the obligation to do filings in my office. It gives us a power to investigate and take enforcement action, and it also involves us in certain transactions involving charities and certain kinds of litigation related to charitable assets. The Charitable Organizations Act is at 1716, And we call that the Solicitation Act. And it applies anytime there's an appeal, and that's an appeal for anything of value. Usually we think about it as being money, but it could be buying a program ad. It could be going to a spaghetti dinner. It could be buying a lemonade at a community festival because it's supporting a local scholarship fund, anything of value. And so that appeal can be in writing. It could be over the internet. It could be a telephone call. It could be a doorbell call, a letter. So whenever you ask for that sort of gift, that is a solicitation. And so it requires the registration of all entities that are soliciting Ohioans. So for instance, 109, the Charitable Trust Act, applies to Ohio charities. 1716 also applies to any out-of-state charities that might be asking for support from Ohioans. So if the Jacques Cousteau Society does a direct mail campaign that sends requests for funding out to Ohioans, they don't have an office here, they don't provide programs here, but they would then need to register under the requirements of 1716 because they're soliciting Ohioans. So 1716 also covers the activities of professional solicitors and fundraising counsel. Professional solicitors have to be bonded. They have to provide notices of what campaigns they're undertaking with charities and the contract with the charity and how much they're going to, whenever a gift comes in, how much goes to the charity, how much is retained by the professional solicitor. And that information is available online in some charts. It gives us enforcement power. And the very key thing that's important to remember about 1716, if you're raising money for a charitable cause, you're not allowed to lie about it. You can't be fraudulent, you can't be misleading, so you have to be honest, which sometimes is a difficult thing for some folks to remember. So being forthright and honest is critical for every organization in its solicitation efforts, and for great organizations, you certainly have that in your blood. You want, everything you do to sparkle so that the community can have, great faith in the activities you undertake. Nonprofit corporation laws at 1702. It defines some of the basics of how nonprofits are expected to behave in the state of Ohio. I used to always say this makes great bedtime reading, but I'm a much bigger fan now. 1702, for instance, says you have to have at least 3 board members. There's language in 1702 that you can sometimes look to provide guidance on issues that might not be mentioned in your governing documents, and we're primarily referring to your bylaws, your constitution, your code of regulation, whatever you want to refer to it as. But for instance, 1702 was critical during the pandemic. 1702 says that unless your bylaws specifically prohibit it, you are allowed to do board meetings and other functions like that using Zoom and other types of platforms that we've all become so reliant on lately. So this was a real keen issue that many organizations were able to ensure that the ongoing functions of their charity could be protected during the pandemic. So there is some great default language in 1702 should questions come up. And then I mentioned that we license bingo. We do trainings for folks that are interested in thinking about bingo. Doing bingo, which is either the classical game that we played with B4 and 089, those require a license anytime you're using them to raise funds for your organization. So purse bingo requires a license. Instant tickets are also a form of bingo, and they often look like lottery tickets that you can kind of crack the back on and various windows open up and they tell you whether you're a winner or not. You can sell those instant tickets either in connection with a regular bingo game, or you can sell them, have even a restaurant or a hotel or bar or gas station in your community sell them on behalf of your organization. And that requires what we call a Type 3 license. We have additional training on all those details. And so because there's a lot of cash involved, it makes it really important to make sure you have a large volunteer base that can make sure that money isn't walking out the door when you engage in that kind of fundraising. So check out Bingo School, and there's a whole page on our webpage about bingo. Now, something we get questions about every day in our office are raffles. Raffles are permitted under 2915 for charitable organizations. If you're a 501c3, you're allowed to have as many raffles as you want. There is no sort of licensing or registration in Ohio for raffles. If you're not a 501c3, but you are in the list of other types of tax-exempt entities that can that are charitable organizations like C4, 7, 8, 10, 19, you have to give 50% of the proceeds from that raffle to a 501c3 or a government entity. So you only get to keep for the operations of your non-501c3 entity 50% of the proceeds. An important thing to know is that only charitable organizations can have raffles. People and companies cannot. So I cannot decide to raffle off my husband's antique motorcycle to support breast cancer research. That would be an illegal raffle. However, if I went to the Stephanie Spielman Cancer Center at Ohio State's James Cancer Hospital and said, hey, I'm interested in supporting the research that goes on connected with your organization, would you be interested in this idea of a raffle? And they agree, and it becomes their raffle, which you would then be free to contact all your friends to try to buy a raffle ticket. Then it becomes a legal raffle. So it has to be run and controlled by a charitable organization. Otherwise, it's an illegal raffle. Now, charities are also permitted to have casino nights and other ways that employ charitable gaming aspects. So you might see that charities might occasionally have a casino night. There's no registration required for that. But the guidelines in 2915 are very specific about some of the details surrounding that kind of activity. Now, let me also back up and explain. It wasn't that long ago that Ohio was a non-gambling state. And the General Assembly carved out a number of exceptions to our non-gambling status for charities to be able to use some of these techniques to raise funds for their important work. Bingo is one, raffles is another, casino nights is another. However, these details are in 2915. 2915 is part of Ohio's criminal code. So violations of any of these provisions could result in criminal prosecution. And those decisions are going to be made by local law enforcement, not by the charitable law section. We don't have any individual criminal authority. That all rests with local police, municipal police, county sheriff's deputies. So when you're engaging in any of these activities, make sure you're doing them correctly. So for instance, if you have a casino night, you're never allowed to have them at a restaurant or a hotel. You can only have them at a facility owned by the charity, one that's leased from a veteran or government or veteran facility. And there are limitations on how many times a veteran facility can lease their premises out for that. There are firm details about what you can do there. You can never play craps or roulette. So you need to make sure that you're paying particular attention to the details in 2915. So sometimes you might want to consult local counsel or even local law enforcement to check out that what you're doing meets the requirements of 2915 and doesn't constitute instead some sort of illegal gambling activity. Now, I mentioned early on that whether you're on a large or a small group, you have the exact same duties and obligations to the organization you're connected with. And we refer to those duties as fiduciary duties. And so we're going to run through what it looks like to live up to your duty of care, your duty of loyalty, duty to maintain accounts, and duty of compliance. So your duty of care, you know, we don't expect people on boards to be lawyers, CPAs, financial gurus. You know, Joe and Sushma make wonderful board members. But we kind of define what it looks like when you're living up to your standard of care. And this is language that comes from our unincorporated charitable trust language. And so we expect people to act with the same amount of care, skill, and diligence that imaginary, ordinarily prudent person would use in how they handle their family affairs. So for instance, if you would not cash your check on Friday, put all the money in a paper bag and leave it overnight on your front porch for your son to pick up on Saturday morning sometime, do not do that with the concession stand money from the Boosters refreshment stand from the football game. If you wouldn't treat your own money this way, do not treat the charity's money in the same manner. So what are other things that indicate you're living up to your duty of care? If you're on the board, you're going to attend meetings. And if you get information ahead of the board meeting, you're going to actually read them and be prepared to be a participant in the meeting. And so what we really want to see happen is if you have questions, maybe you ask the question of the executive director in advance of the meeting. So when everyone comes together for that limited time when people are together, they're making the highest and best use of their time to really think about higher level activities for the organization instead of doing responsive readings of committee meeting notes. Those could be shared in advance, and maybe the committee instead puts forth a question for the board to wrestle with. So when you come to the meeting, you also need to be prepared to know that every vote you take, you yourself know that it's in the best interest of the organization. You cannot just rubber stamp what someone else says. You also cannot be bullied out of asking questions because you have a right to make sure you know what you're voting on. And so if someone, you know, is trying to stand in the way of you getting answers, their vote doesn't count any more than your vote does. And so you can be held accountable for what you do and what you fail to do. So take care and think things through so that you feel comfortable when you're casting a yes or no vote on a question before the board. I mentioned before, number one duty of boards and living up to your duty of care will be indicated by establishing policies. And then the board will also be involved, if you're large enough to have staff, in the selection and management of key leaders. Other duty of care issues concerns developing various policies. I mentioned financial controls as being job number one. Take a look at that brochure I mentioned. And then conflict of interest issues we're going to talk about in a minute. Maybe you need a number of policies surrounding your financial operations. Maybe you want to have a special policy or procedure for major expenditures. What's a major expenditure? Well, a major expenditure for the Cleveland Clinic Foundation is going to be far different than a small food pantry in a small neighborhood. So what constitutes a major expenditure to you? Is it something that you want to have the whole board vote on? Is it something you want to have a policy of major expenditures over $2,000 will require at least 3 vendor estimates? If you are a large group, maybe you want to have an investment policy for reserve funds that maybe you even have a growth or opportunity fund that you carry and try to build year after year. The board can make investment policies. What level of risk are you willing to assume on behalf of the organization for how those investments are handled. Do you want to invest in Bitcoin? I don't. So you can decide those sorts of things. You can also make policies about what kind of gifts you're willing to accept and what kind you might not want to accept at all. So for instance, if you don't think you have the capacity within your organization to properly transfer automobile titles, because that needs to be done in a very careful way, then maybe you have a policy that our organization does not directly accept the gift of used cars or boats or other things that come with titles. And then some organizations, based on the work they do, have policies about who they will accept gifts from. So perhaps if you are an organization that works with folks that have substance abuse problems, maybe you want a policy that says we don't accept any money from the liquor industry. You may choose to have that policy, or you may also say, you know what, this problem is great. We need everything we can get. Yes, they help get our clients where they are, but we need resources and we'll take whatever they have to offer. That's also an appropriate decision for the board to conclude with. And there are sometimes situations in which the board may need some expert advice, maybe something unique or something with a lot of risk has come up that you've never encountered before. Sometimes the board may say, you know what, I think we need to hire a lawyer to advise us. Or, you know, I'm a little concerned about our internal controls. Maybe we need to hire someone to do a forensic audit for us. Or, you know, if I'm with the Anywhere Boosters and we decide we want to build a certain grandstand for the marching band at football games, maybe instead of everyone just bringing a hammer on Saturday morning, you decide that you want to hire someone who's a construction expert to oversee this project so that it ends up being a safe structure. So there are all kinds of instances where the board can just decide we need help, we need to get some expertise about what the risks and benefits of a certain position might be. You can have policies on your meetings, or where you're going to have them, how often, if it's not already defined in your bylaws. Committees, how many there are. Are you going to allow outsiders to your board meetings? Will you have a spot where you just accept testimony from anyone that wants to come in from the community? And then under federal law, it is prohibited to take action against someone who is a whistleblower, who is trying to raise awareness and attention to someone who's committing fraud within your organization. So you're going to want to make sure that you have some sort of policy where that information gets to the board safely and quickly, so that if something is going on, you can take action to shut off the leak of that faucet. Some companies, some corporations actually provide the service of providing 1-800 whistleblower, where you can outsource it to someone else to take the calls. But indeed, it is always something that the board will want to know about, you know, if someone is taking advantage of the organization. So how do you live up to your duty of care? Well, in short, you got to be paying attention. Duty of loyalty. So we are all busy people these days. We're wearing lots of different hats. But when you are sitting at the board table, you are wearing one hat and one hat only, and that is what is in the best interest of the organization. It can never be, how can I use this position to either generate more business for my company? How can I use this position to elevate my own social status in the community or to do favors for my friends? It must be solely about what is in the best interest of the organization. And so we commonly address these kinds of issues through conflict of interest policies. Generally, you have a conflict of interest policy that will provide that every board member and key employees annually fill out a conflict of interest form that generally will ask for information about the workplaces of those who live in your household, any routine personal interests you have that might intersect with the ongoing business of the organization, but you're not just limited to that. And so we want to see these issues looked at more than just once a year when you fill out the annual form. And so when issues come before the board where someone has maybe split interests in what the outcome of the decision might be, that's a conflict of interest. And so we want you to speak out and say, you know, I may have a conflict of interest on this issue. And what we want to ensure is that only the board members who don't have a vested interest in the outcome of an issue are the ones voting on it. So here's what could happen. I may be on the board of Anywhere booster group. I may own Beth's Builders. That booster group may decide they want to send out a request for proposals to all of the construction companies in town. My company may well decide to issue a response to this proposal. Now, when this issue comes before the board at the next meeting, when they're going to go through the proposals and select the contractor to use, when that item comes up on the agenda, I am going to say, excuse me, but I have a conflict of interest on this issue, and I'm going to leave the room. I want to make sure that the minutes said Beth left the room for the agenda item on the bandstand for the marching band. I leave the room because that makes everyone else able to have a really candid discussion. No one will have to sit there and feel like I'm giving them the evil eye if I raise questions about Beth's Builders proposal. And so we want people to have a fair and honest discussion about the merits of every one of the proposals, but it may well end up that Beth's Builders has always been supportive of local high school athletics throughout the county. My proposal is just for cost of goods, far better than any of the other proposals on the table, and no one knows of any reason not to work with my company. It's known for doing quality work. And so all the non-conflicted board members will then take a vote and decide to vote for Beth's Builders to receive this contract. Not until that issue is finalized by a vote that I return to the room, and the minutes need to indicate I returned after the decision of the board on the contract issue. And so many times conflict of interest issues don't emerge next week. It's often months and months down the road. So if you get it into the minutes, no one has to recreate from memory what happened. The record of what happened is represented in the minutes. So make sure the minutes always indicate how you responded to conflict of interest issues. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a conflict of interest pop up. In fact, they're going to. Unless you have people on your board who live under rocks, you're going to have conflicts of interest emerge. And so what we want to see is that you have an environment within your organization where you just have open discussions about when these issues come up. And so again, it's not whether or not you have conflicts of interest, it's how you deal with them afterwards. Now, the third duty we talk about is the duty to maintain accounts. That's a no-brainer. It's directly related to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of internal controls. But we expect charitable organizations to have budgets. We expect boards to monitor reports to make sure that spending is going as you projected. We expect organizations to keep records of money that comes in and money that goes out. We need documentation to ensure that every expenditure that is in the books of the organization is something that is used in pursuit of fulfilling the mission of the organization. So if we go in to visit an organization and we see there are a lot of credit card charges to Victoria's Secret, we're going to ask for an explanation about that, and you should have documentation that explains what those purchases were and documenting how they're used in pursuit of the mission. We expect you to maintain these kinds of records. There are great resources online about how long you should retain various types of records. In the state of Ohio, we require you, for instance, to keep fundraising records for at least 3 years. There are various tax requirements that you should be aware of, that the IRS has, and then depending on what programs your organization engages on, there may be other outside requirements about how long records are kept. But it's clear that charities have access to all kinds of personal information. It can be personal information about employees, about volunteers, about donors, about clients of your organization that you wouldn't want to fall in the wrong hands. And so make sure that your staff, your volunteers are aware of sound practices using, cybersecurity issues so that cyber criminals don't capture your organization's valuable information. We have a publication online called Cybersecurity Issues for Charities and Small Businesses that you might want to take a look at. Unfortunately, charities are a target of cyber criminals. Some people mistakenly think it's just large corporations, but unfortunately these days this is something that we have to be mindful of, both at work, with our charities, and with our family lives. So make sure you're not downloading unexpected attachments and that sort of thing with the computers that you're using for your charity. Duty of compliance. Board members need to make sure that organizations are living up to their legal obligations in a number of areas. There are federal and state issues that we're going to touch on briefly. Your governing documents, your bylaws, your constitution, your code of regulations, whatever you call them. If it says that you're going to have an annual members meeting every November to elect a slate of officers, and the bylaws also say you're going to have a nominating committee present a slate of officers every October, then you need to get that on the planning calendar for the upcoming year. Make sure that that happens. However, if it no longer makes sense to have that meeting, then you can change your bylaws. But until you do, you are legally obligated to follow what's in those documents. This is how you have set forth to the public how your organization is going to operate. You may well have other agreements, other contracts in place that the board will want to make sure the organization is complying with. Sometimes you may have grant funds or contracts for services that the board is going to want to make sure that you are living up to and completing in the ways that you have an obligation to. And then you also need to live up to the promises you make in your solicitations. So if you tell people that your contribution will be used to build a grandstand for the marching band, that's how you need to use those monies. You can't use them instead to support a local cat shelter. So you need to live up to those promises. It's part of your duty of compliance. So under federal law, we're primarily thinking about the IRS. Now, the IRS expects you to live up with and comply with all of these various governance things that we've been talking about. They expect to see annual returns from you. They have an expectation also. 501c3s, for instance, are prohibited from endorsing candidates for political office or making contributions to political campaign funds. So 501c3 charities are prohibited from what I call the R&D kinds of politics, meaning Republican and Democrat. However, if you are with a domestic violence shelter and your city council is thinking about modifying your domestic violence laws within the city, your organization will be a great expert to provide feedback to the city council about what potential changes might mean for the folks that you serve. So be mindful of those restrictions because violating them can lead to the immediate revocation of your organization's tax exempt status. Sarbanes-Oxley, which was passed years ago to address some fraud within publicly traded companies, there's two provisions that apply to charities. One is the whistleblower protection, which I mentioned earlier. But the other one is if you're under investigation by the feds, do not start destroying documents. Now, under state law, we've gone through how you have an obligation to do an annual filing with the Attorney General's office. And by the way, the filing of your 990 is due the same day as you're filing with our system. And so sometimes it helps if people think about them jointly, kind of like how we do our income taxes. We have a state return and a federal return. So those two filings are due the exact same day. So you need to make sure that you're up to date and compliant with your filings with our office. You're going to also want to keep up to date with your responsibilities to the Secretary of State's office and ensuring that the articles of incorporation are not canceled for your organization. And then there may well be other sorts of regulations that apply to the work that you do, and that will vary by organization. So if you have employees, you're going to have to take care of Social Security, unemployment, other types of things that all employers need to take care of and be mindful of. If you're engaged in, if our booster group runs a concession stand at Friday night football games, there may well be local health department regulations that we need to be mindful of and make sure that we're complying with. So this all depends on what your organization does, and your board needs to know that there's a system in place to live up to these obligations. So board governance, where do you start? Hopefully what you walk away with is a feeling that this is all common sense stuff. Doing it the right way generally only takes a little bit more work than what some of those who end up in trouble are doing. So just start somewhere. You're never done paying attention to board governance. Even if you're the most sophisticated organization out there, board governance issues change, as does the many issues and programs that your organization will be offering over time. One of the things I find people are most nervous about are budgetary issues. Well, again, you don't have to be a CPA to be helpful on most boards. You will find that much like your family budget, many of the small and medium-sized charitable organizations have routine expenses and routine types of income. You'll begin to recognize what those are. You'll also get a feeling of the timing of when those come and when those go. We make all kinds of decisions about our household budgets all the time, and it will become, after a period of getting acclimated, a very natural thing for you. And what you will want to do is be on the lookout for variations from what you expected. And then you should ask questions, because if certain expenses come in much higher than you anticipated, is there a good reason for that? Do you need to do something because of that? Maybe find a separate vendor. Maybe, everyone knows that utility prices were very high for the last year because we had a rough winter. Or maybe that's where someone is hiding some of the damage they might be doing to your organization. So ask. Again, the thing that you need to be mindful of is looking for unexpected things and asking questions about. Just like if we would receive a credit card bill at our house for $200 that we didn't get to enjoy spending, we would be asking questions. This is what you need to shoot for when you're thinking about your fiduciary obligations to provide oversight of the funds. But I cannot overstate the importance of making sure your board has processes in place that protect the assets that you have. The board is the first line in the defense of those assets, and making sure that you're really honoring the charitable mission, which is probably what got you interested in being involved with the organization. And remember, these processes, they protect the organization, but they also protect the people. The financial reports, if you're with a larger organization, you may well have staff, financial staff, and you may think you have the best CEO and CFO in the country, and I hope that's the case. But that doesn't mean that board members can just rubber stamp. They need to exert independent oversight and ask questions. Sometimes you may have a board committee that is maybe an audit or a budget committee, and they can play, a really critical role in taking the deep dive on these questions. So it's up to each group to work out what makes the most sense for this organization, its size, and its activities. And that may need to change over time. It's also important to know that the board is the one that provides oversight of the executive director, not the other way around. We've had some situations in which an executive director has basically held a board hostage, and the executive director is hiring and appointing board members. That's a situation that's upside down. The board is the one that needs to provide the oversight, develop policies, direct the vision of the executive director in a policy way so that he or she can then implement and execute the vision that is developed at the board level. Now, the other thing to mention is, it's not fair to anyone serving as the executive director if he or she feels that they have 15 different individual bosses. Each board member is asking questions, making inquiries, reaching out, and has different expectations than the whole. That is an unlivable situation for anyone. So it requires respect and give and take. If you are going to be hiring a new executive director, take the hiring process seriously. What skills do you need? What's the job description say? Do you have an adequate pool of candidates? Maybe you talk to other charities that do similar work. Be sure to do reference checks and background checks. Are there any skeletons in their closets, particularly involving theft or fraud? You can also set expectations for that person so that there is a shared set of expectations about how often the director should communicate to the board. When does the board specifically want to be involved? It's also important to know that the board's job is not to, and it can become a huge headache if the board members are reaching out and communicating with various staff members. Not appropriate. You're the policy-making entity, and those policies are then executed through the executive director. Again, I mentioned it requires a balance, and it requires professionalism and respect. Do evaluations of your executive director. Do evaluations of the services that are provided by your organization. How is the organization viewed? How is it viewed by others in the community and working with your organization? So the goal is to always be on, a continuous improvement line for everybody. And hopefully the executive director and every member of the board's goal is to, maximize the ability to honor the mission of the group. Now, the board can consider all kinds of policies and develop policies on any number of things, and the need for policies will vary. Obviously, if you don't have employees, you don't need to have an HR policy. But maybe you decide, it's been a long time since we've looked at our HR policies. I think we might make that a goal for the year of the organization, the board. We're going to update our HR policies. So you can make decisions about what things to focus on from year to year. I've mentioned in passing the concept of an annual checkup. I think, again, all board members need to know the basic lineup information about your organization as it applies to the Secretary of State, the AG, and the IRS. Go in and do a simple check. It takes you 5 minutes to do that. I also think at the beginning of every program year, it's helpful to do kind of a broader checkup involving the whole board. Does everyone know what's in the bylaws? What have we promised to do? Do we have a planning calendar for moving everything forward? Is everything recorded on the planning calendar that we have promised through our bylaws? When does the budget process start? Who's going to take care of the filings of the AG and the 990? When's the board going to see those before they're actually submitted? There's all kinds of things that you can do to try to help get everyone on the same page every time a new year begins. And when you develop these kinds of timelines and transition documents, that way you don't have to redevelop them from scratch every year. You can augment them as needed to work in things that come with special needs that may pop up. Maybe you want to talk to an insurance carrier about whether all your insurance coverage is up to date. Are there any unexpected risks that you haven't accounted for? It's always helpful to have a board orientation process for new board members. That would include tours of any programs or facilities, an overview of financial reports, what they represent. Are there certain indicators that are key benchmark issues for your organization? Maybe you want to pair a new board member up with a more veteran board member so they have someone they can talk to about their eagerness to jump in sooner rather than later and provide value. And then some boards engage in strategic planning, in which you're taking maybe a 3 to 5 year look at where you would like to see your organization in the future. Unfortunately, anyone that engaged in strategic planning prior to 2020 certainly did not include a pandemic in their plans. And so charities have had to react immediately to situations that no one could have ever foreseen. And as we go through this experience, it may be necessary to take a look at planning again in the future, now that we've, how are we performing during this emergency? And then what will things look afterwards? Things may be very different. And in good organizations, boards evaluate themselves. They take a look at, evaluating each person on the board. How are they doing in living up to their obligations to the organization? Are they showing up and participating in meetings? Does the board need to maybe create a new committee because you haven't been able to really take a focused look at something you had wanted to? Maybe you decide that you want a broader geographic representation on the board, or maybe try to get someone that has a particular expertise that you're missing. Diversity is important, and diversity represents all kinds of issues. And when we have diverse organizations, you often get the benefit of perspectives that may be missing from your discussions. Lack of diversity can also hamstring the growth of organizations. So think of diversity quite broadly, and whether there is a way that you can adopt some practices that will result in having more diverse organization. Now, the great news is there are a lot of resources out there to help board members in every aspect of their operation, really. We are trying to provide a number of resources out there that we hope are helpful. This is kind of a snapshot of our webpage, and we have ongoing changing information when new information hits. There are major boxes at the top of the page that show the main categories that people often interact with us on, but there's also a portion in the lower part of the web page that are boxes of issues that come up a lot. So you'll find that there's a whole box on charitable webinars that includes registration information for live webinars as well as recorded webinars on a number of topics. And then resources for charities includes additional information that we hope is helpful to those who are out there engaged in the running of great groups. I like to throw out some of my other favorites. Both the Better Business Bureau and the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations have various standards programs. The Better Business Bureau has a Charity Seal program, whereby if a charitable organization can show that they comply with a number of standards, then they will be eligible to use the Better Business Charity Seal logo on their materials. OANO has a similar Standards of Excellence program, which is a very thorough deep dive into various procedures and policy of the board. But take a look at the standards that both of these organizations have. These are best practices that have been identified by leaders across the country. How does your group stack up when you take a look at those standards? That can often provide some guidance for the board in looking at goals for the coming year. BoardSource is a wonderful resource for publications on all aspects of running a charity, whether it's fundraising, grant writing, volunteer management. BoardSource will have it. It's one of my favorites. The IRS actually has some wonderful resources on their webpage, including some video training programs. It's no longer just for CPAs, so take a look and see if there's helpful information there that can guide your organization. And then the Chronicle of Philanthropy is kind of the publication that covers the trends within the charitable sector. There are countless books at the library and in bookstores on lots of nonprofit topics. One thing we often don't do well in the charitable sector is to talk to colleagues with other organizations. We sometimes see them only as competitors for scarce fundraising resources, but when we work together, we can often do more. And chances are good that maybe a challenge you're experiencing has been experienced by another local charity. Pick up the phone and dial another executive director with another group and say, have you ever had this issue? How did you respond? And they might have some great advice for you about things to do and things not to do. And then sometimes it might be difficult to find a board member with a specific set of skills that you might need. For instance, maybe you've decided you do want to update your HR policies for the year. You may not be able to find an HR person who's willing to sit on the board. And sometimes board service, many people are afraid of because it feels like a life sentence. But if you have a discrete project with a beginning and an end, consider reaching out to a local company and asking if they might loan you an executive from their HR operation. It can be a great way to get some high quality consulting services. And so that is the basic overview, and all of this varies based on specifics of your organization. And if you have suggestions for additional tools that we should develop that might be helpful, please let us know. That's what we want to do. Again, we are grateful and appreciative for the work that all of you put into working with charitable organizations. You know, the quality of our lives are greatly enhanced by the work of charities, and we especially have an appreciation of that, and thank you for it. Here's information on how to contact us. Again, our web page is at charitable.ohioago.gov, and our email address is charitableLaw, all one word, at ohioattorneygeneral.gov. Again, thank you for attending this board governance webinar.